Hi, this is Christian Takushi, your independent macroeconomist and geopolitical strategist. I'm coming to you with a geopolitical roundup. There's so many things, flashpoints, they're creating some friction around the world, and I want to focus on 10, the 10 most relevant ones that I can see at the moment. There are, again, so many around the world. On the macroeconomic front or the geopolitical front that we could really sit here for hours and go through them. But I think for the sake of time, I won't focus just on, I would say, the top 10 areas of relevant friction or tension around the world that should be important from a geopolitical and economic point of view. I will start with UK. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has survived the vote of no confidence, something that in the short term I welcome because I think that he has to address the Northern Ireland Protocol situation and also the current situation in Ukraine. The war is not going very well for Ukraine there, and these are two things that he has championed. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has championed Brexit. He also championed a tremendous British support for Ukraine. No other country is supporting Ukraine the way Britain is doing it. So I think it makes more sense for Prime Minister Boris Johnson to finish the job on these two, to finish the job, or at least to oversee what's being done in these two areas in the short term. I also believe that Prime Minister Boris Johnson is probably smart, is quite smart in pushing for an adjustment of the Northern Ireland Protocol because currently the EU is obviously depending on British military shield and the British military deterrent. So the timing is quite good. Having said that, I believe that the extensive decline in the morality of our Western leaders and Western political leaders, but also business leaders, is making it necessary that military leaders should consider stepping forward to serve. Not every country has an excellent military, but Britain has. The UK has one of the most impressive, superb militaries around the world, and I think the time has probably come for a British politician with military background, or for a former British military officer that wants to serve the nation, to step forward and to consider being the successor of Prime Minister Boris Johnson. I think that the British military is one of the very few institutions out in the world, around the world, that is really still forging real leaders. We don't have leaders anymore in the world. What we call leaders are good administrators and good managers. Good administrators and managers are good in times of continuity and stability, but in the times that we're facing now, terrible times, difficult times, where all the crises we have been procrastinating on are coming together. Yes, the West hasn't solved one single crisis over the past 40 years. We've just been printing money and procrastinating. Now they're all coming together at the same time. This is a difficult, perilous time, and I think we need real leaders, and I don't see many other institutions that have real leaders, that produce real leaders with character, vision, ability to lead, discipline, and values. I think only a leader with a strong military background would be able to regain the confidence of the people in Britain, and not just in Britain, I think in many other countries. I'll move up to the second point, Israel. Israel has been let down by Washington again in recent days for the third time in less than a year. Again, Washington leaking very important information that threatens national security of Israel, and this has confirmed to Jerusalem that it cannot fully rely on Washington the way it used to do. Um, this is only going to mean that Israel is going to increase its efforts to build new alliances instead of just relying on Washington. And this is something I've been telling you for a few years. It's everyone for himself, and there are now more alliances out there, more military, more security alliances than competing nations. Um, just Turkey has 7 military alliances. Israel is now building 5, 6 military security arrangements or alliances, because you cannot just rely. You can no longer rely on the United States, and there are a lot of people that are still talking about a renewal or or comeback of the Cold War. I find it interesting because the Cold War was a period of stability. There were 2 blocs, and everybody knew in which bloc he or she was. Today's situation is very different. No one can trust his friends. No one can trust anyone. And even within NATO, there are 5 different factions because it is a flow alliance, a very asymmetric alliance. Some are there just to defend, others are just there to cause trouble, you could say. So it is what it is. But the current situation is worse than the Cold War. And I believe this is the reason why we are going to see several wars, major wars, big wars in the Northern Hemisphere, and this in the next decade. The next area I want to touch upon, before I finish this area, let me also touch on Iran, because Iran is very important for the Middle East. The International Atomic Agency has confirmed that Iran is just weeks away from having enough enriched uranium for at least 1 or 2 ballistic missiles. Iran has a large number of improved mid-range ballistic missiles, and I think also that if Iran has been smart, it has used all the money, a lot of the money that President Biden gave it, and the technology support that Europe gave it, to also obtain enriched uranium from the black market internationally. Interesting, something that no one touches upon. Everybody's focusing on the uranium that Iran enriches domestically, and nobody wants to talk about the uranium that the material that Iran was able to buy and procure internationally under the shield of the Iran agreement or the Iran deal. The West gave Iran the money. The West gave Iran the securities that its military missile program will be protected. And the West didn't put any conditions or real de facto conditions on how Iran is going to use that money. So that's something that I believe is going to be very interesting. And very, very soon, Iran's nuclear ballistic missiles will be able to reach 3,400 kilometers. That is Western Europe. So I wonder how Europe will deal with that, because this is the result of European policy as well. That's not just Iran causing trouble here. Iran is doing what Iran does. Iran is trying to advance its own national interests. But I think here we're talking about a massive failure of Europe, of our leaders over the past 12 years. Another point I want to touch upon is the Far East. The Far East, we're dealing here with a major fiasco for the Biden administration. I think we have 3 to comment today. Well, this is the first one. President Biden visited Japan very recently and said very clearly and tacitly that in case China invades Taiwan, that the U.S. will protect and defend Taiwan, and so should Japan. President Biden was in Tokyo to encourage Japan to also defend Taiwan proactively, and should Japan come under, basically, should be also attacked, President Biden implied that the United States would be there to defend and support its ally. Since the same arrangement is being done with South Korea, this was also understood in Seoul, that the U.S. would be defending Seoul if South Korea would also opt to protect Taiwan and Japan. Well, but as soon as President Biden was in the air again, having left Tokyo, Washington, to be exact, the White House gave a dementi. It said that President Biden had not given any such assertions, any such commitments. Well, this is one of the greatest political foreign policy blunders, fiascos I have seen in my, well, I don't know, 37 years that I'm following foreign policy and national security. In those 37 years, I've seldom seen anything like this. A president of the United States visits a very important flashpoint region of the world to encourage its allies, to prop up its allies, and to tell its allies exactly where the U.S. could help them and what they should do or not, to give guidelines, right? And President Biden did it, but as soon as he's out of the region, Washington says that President Biden didn't say what he said. So how should Japanese, Taiwanese, and South Korean allies now think of Washington and the United States? Probably the same as Israel, that they have to look for themselves and after themselves and build up their own military alliances to protect themselves. If they are attacked, the U.S. may help them, but may also not help them. What these Far Eastern Asian allies of the U.S. are now clearly understanding is that the U.S. is going to behave opportunistically. It may defend, it may not defend. If it's not in the best interest of the U.S. at that given moment, the U.S. will not defend Japan and will not defend Taiwan either. And by logical induction, it may not defend South Korea as well. This is what the Seoul, Tokyo, and Taipei are actually digesting for the last 10 days. Quite remarkable, really. I don't know what happened there or who is in charge. President Biden made some very, very explicit statements. That those statements were just taken back by the White House raises many issues, and not just in the Far East. Here in Europe, some military intelligence in some countries, some European NATO allies are also wondering if President Biden is is chief in command of the U.S. military. He makes some statements as a chief in command, but his statements are within 2 days denied by Washington. Well, who is in charge, really? This is something that is raised quite a lot of insecurity amongst U.S. allies, and I think this is one of the biggest fiascos, at least that I have seen in 37 years. The next area, point number 5, is Russia. Russia is trying to respond to what it sees as NATO's incursion into his backyard, which is Ukraine, and their very interesting development. Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba are being reported to have offered Russia their soil, their sovereign territory, for Russia to build a major military base there, capable of handling nuclear missiles. From my own analysis, I ascertained that Russia has not decided yet the way forward, but it is very likely that Russia may come up on one of these offers and build, or at least announce, the buildup of such a military base and the deployment of nuclear weapons there. It could be maybe Russia's answer to the U.S. Well, if you want us to accept NATO on our border, on our backyard, so how will you handle if we moved onto the U.S. backyard? Maybe something like that is going to happen, and this will be a very interesting escalation to the conflict that has started in Ukraine. As you've heard from me in the past, there is no going back. There is no going back. Even if there is a peace deal in Ukraine, there is no going back to the world that we had before February this year. The West and the East are going to stay in a state of hostilities. There might be some deceitful peace for some time, but even if there is a kind of a peace deal in Ukraine, I am pretty sure that at one point Russia is going to strike with the first strike either Western Europe or the United States, because I think that they feel extremely aggravated, extremely humiliated by the West. This is what I read. It is my independent analysis, not coming from anybody else. So even if things looking good, I would be cautious with premature celebrations and people reading only Western news. We're in times of war. We have to be careful with what we read, and everything looks like a great celebration. NATO, EU leaders have been celebrating and congratulating each other for the last 6 weeks about the end of Russia, the defeat of Russia. I would just remain very, very cautious with that. I would like to see 5 years of China and Russia not attacking the West to be sure that this is being settled, not before that. Next point. Number 6. China and Russia have grown their direct trade dramatically. Not only that, they have begun to do a direct currency exchange. That direct currency exchange is done without the US dollar and without the euro, and also circumventing the European SWIFT banking system. I think this is very dangerous for the West, very, very dangerous, because other nations, non-aligned nations like India, like Brazil, like Mexico, South Africa, Indonesia, Pakistan, etc., etc. These are big nations, are paying attention and are actually sending envoys to both, to the region to see how it's been done, because they also want to do more direct trade without having to use the debased European and US money. They want to do it without using debased euros and debased US dollars. As I said before, all our sanctions on Russia were fine and I think deserved, but to exclude Russia from the SWIFT banking system and to seize the dollar and euro foreign reserves of Russia, I think was a great mistake, because it's going to hurt the West. It's going to hurt us, the West, much more than it hurts Russia. Especially other nations are now saying, what guarantees do we have that the West is not going to do the same to us? So why should we use debased euros and debased dollars as foreign reserve, and why should we rely so much on the European banking system and SWIFT? Well, it will take time, but many nations have begun the works for a circumvention, to circumvent Western Europe and the United States, our financial system. Now I want to touch on Ukraine again very, very, very shortly. Mr. President Macron and Chancellor Scholz are joining forces to try to bring forward a potential peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. They're trying to work towards Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Putin talking together. I don't think they're going to meet personally, but for a kind of peace deal to be worked upon. Now, this idea of President Macron and Chancellor Scholz is being seen with fury and anger by Poland and most other Eastern European nations, and Washington itself. Washington is not appreciating that Paris and Berlin are showing too much of an initiative. So NATO is quite divided. Some nations would like to go to war straight ahead, go to war with Russia. Others would like to wait. Others would like to, try to find a peace solution. And those who are trying to find a peace solution, like Berlin and Paris, are being called traitors by the other NATO members. As you have heard from me before, NATO is very much misunderstood. People think that NATO is just a blessing, but when you join a military alliance that has Article 5, something like Article 5 in it, very good if you are attacked, you know that the others will have to protect you. But if the others have nothing to protect you, only 2 of the 30 allies can protect you, is that a good alliance? Now, the other issue is, how about you join an alliance where one of these 30 members can take the whole alliance to war? Well, the enemy could attack you too, although you have nothing to do with it. The point that I'm making is, one Eastern European nation could take NATO to war with Russia. Russia would attack all of the 30, could attack any of the 30 NATO nations, even those that probably are not directly involved. So any NATO member nation could be dragged into a war by another NATO member, and this is what I would call the reversed effect of Article 5. Article 5 can work in your favor, but also against you. And this is something I've checked. It looks like no European capital, no European military leaders, no European political leaders have considered that there is a risk for them. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the divisions between NATO members and EU members is horrific. They are calling each other horrible names. They are threatening each other. I have heard that there have been threats spoken against. There are leaders in the EU and NATO. They are speaking of threats against other leaders of the EU and NATO. And that which they say in the press is just the tip of the iceberg, right? So there is, I have said all the time, when an alliance is flawed and asymmetric, and 27 are there to do whatever they want, even misbehave, and only 3 can defend, well, what kind of alliance is that where 3 have to defend all other 27? That is not a real alliance, in my opinion. And in this case, is not the biggest mistake has been done by EU, Western Europe and EU member states. They have been dismantling their militaries for the last 20 years, dismantling them, and still being committed to NATO. So the US and Britain and maybe France had to defend them all. I think that if somebody has bankrupted NATO, it is the EU. It has to be said. Point number 8. As Latin America shifts hard left, the security of key commodities is fading away. Latin America, ladies and gentlemen, is shifting left, hard left, very strongly. And unfortunately, countries like Chile, Peru, Colombia, that used to be stars and model economies for free markets and capitalism, are being lost to communist, socialist leaders, and we have to follow this situation quite carefully. I'm awaiting now results soon. When Colombia will vote, it looks like the leftist candidate will win, and we already see that many Latin American nations were reticent, were not keen to send their presidents to the summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. President Biden wanted to invite all the presidents of Latin America, of the Americas, and to his shock, quite a number of Latin American presidents said, "I'm not interested to go. I will not go." Kind of that. And well, Washington has used now all kinds of tools and means, pressure, soft pressure, maybe not such a nice pressure, but all kinds of pressures to convince Latin American leaders to attend his summit in Los Angeles. So quite a number of leaders are going there grudgingly, unwillingly, but they're going. And we don't know if President Biden had to threaten them. Some say that they were threatened, but I don't know if this is just political rhetoric. But this summit of the Americas in LA is also turning out to be a fiasco. This is just the way it is. Washington has realized it had lost. Washington has realized in the last 2 months that it does not have the same influence it used to have in the Americas or in Latin America. It is now China. It is now China that has the big influence in Latin America, and these nations don't want to be commanded around by anybody anymore. And this is really bad news for Washington. Yeah, because America and Western Europe need the resources of Latin America. There are key resources that our new green economy needs. Our new green economy that our leaders have envisioned is very intensive, is very investment intensive, but it's also metal intensive. It needs a lot of metals, not just copper. There are quite a number of other metals that are also needed. And if Chile and Peru shift to the left, there will be less investments in copper. And I think that rather than more copper, less copper might be produced in the years to come. I wonder how Western Europe and the US are going to deal with that. So actually, the great shift to a green economy may not happen because Latin America decides to shift left. Now, another one is inflation politics. This is probably the last part. The last part is dedicated to the US. Ladies and gentlemen, inflation politics. Inflation has been reported today at 8.6% over last year. Inflation in the US is running at 8.6% annual pace. Quite a shock to some people. Many politicians in the US and bank experts, investment experts have been saying for the last 6 months, it is just the peak. We just went through the peak. It's just temporary. But actually, it seems to be wishful thinking. Inflation is officially reported at 8.6%. But ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you that this is Western governments are always under-reporting inflation. It pays off for them. When I look at inflation in the United States, and it depends on the region, it's running at 14 to 20% versus last year. So depending where you're living in the United States, you're paying 14% to 20% more for a similar basket of goods and services compared to last year. That is the reality. This is what I believe is closer to, and I believe when I talk to people, my assessment is much closer to the reality that they are facing. Western governments have another option but to under-report inflation. But even this 8.6% is a massive increase of inflation. And I want to say that it is remarkable, and I go to the last point today. The hearings in the U.S. Congress and in Washington, what is happening in Washington this week is completely dedicated to the January 6th storming of the Capitol. And I understand that January 6th was a watershed for U.S. politics, and that needs to be digested, and lessons need to be learned from that. But I am quite surprised at the degree of, I would say, insulation in a way I could say by politicians. Washington is completely immersed in studying what happened on January 6th, and January 6th, right after the elections, the last elections, and passing the blame on President Trump. I understand that fully. I understand that January 6th has to be studied, analyzed, and lessons drawn, and eventually even responsibilities assumed. But what is happening in the last week, these last 5 days, in the economy in the United States is amazing. I don't want to go through everything that's happened this week, but millions of American households, I've calculated roughly 100 million American households are struggling with increasing prices, and some of them are struggling really on a day-to-day basis. For many of them, prices have risen 15 to 20%. since last year, not 8, as the government tells us. And politicians in Washington are not really caring about that. All they're doing is, I mean, I don't want to say that in a derogative way, but all they're focused on is to talk about what happened on January 6th. Ladies and gentlemen, the January 6th has to be taken care of, but politicians cannot be so detached from the reality that their countrymen, countrywomen are facing. Politicians cannot be so cannot really live with such impunity and get away with it. They cannot just be so detached from the suffering and the reality that their fellow countrymen are facing. I find it really hard to believe how Washington can be so detached from the rest of America and the suffering of their people. And I have to say, we now have to deal with the politics of inflation. Both the ECB in Europe and the Fed in the United States have created this inflation. They work very, very, very hard to print huge amount of money to create inflation, first in the stock market, then bond market, then real estate market, then yachts and everything. That inflation finally also swapped over consumer goods, and it is policymakers, our governments, that decided to shut down fossil energy and to rush into green renewable energies that were not ready yet. That was a premature shift, causing the massive rise in energy prices. Energy prices were going up because of our premature shift, badly prepared, badly planned, premature shift into renewable energies. And this increase in energy prices happened way long before the war in Ukraine. So when politicians now are blaming COVID and the war in Ukraine for all the evils that we're facing, especially for high inflation, I find that very sad, very hard to believe that we have reached a point where people are not told the truth, and financial media plays along, and it probably has to play along because everyone is sitting in the same boat. The government, central banks, financial media, investors, retirees, pension funds, they're all sitting on the same boat, and no one wants the interest rates to rise. Most of these investors and banks and financial media would prefer for central banks to start printing money again so that we can celebrate a little bit longer. But I find it hard to believe how detached from the reality politicians can be. They have been creating inflation. They've been creating the foundations for this inflation, and now, after 13 years of zero interest rates, of massive printing of money, they are actually trying to fight 10% inflation with almost zero interest rates. In the United States, the central bank is trying to fight 8% inflation with 2% interest rates. And in Europe, the ECB is gonna try to fight also 6, 7, 8% inflation with what? With 0% interest rates. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that you need to be an economist to know that you cannot fight 10% inflation with 0 or 2% interest rates. No. If you really want to fight 10% inflation, you need to bring interest rates to at least 6 or 7%, at least, to cut off the momentum of it. Well, but that's the world that we're living in. That's what central banks are telling us. They're telling us that they're fighting inflation, but they are not fighting inflation. They don't want to fight inflation. They don't. And I believe it would be better for central banks to be honest and straightforward with the American people and European citizens. to tell them what their real plans are, because how long can they pretend to be fighting inflation with such low with such low interest rates? It's interesting that there is no outcry in the financial media and no outcry amongst banks and major investors. It looks like everyone is just worried about the price of his stocks and the value of his portfolios. But I finish with this. How important is that? How important is the value of those portfolios if it is measured in debased money? We're talking about debased dollars and debased euros. I think that we may have to consider the possibility that central banks may have to normalize. What does it mean, normalize? Gentlemen, what some central banks have been discussing in recent years is a great normalization, that which they have inflated over the past 40 years, they may have to deflate to some extent. If they have inflated wealth, financial assets and wealth, they may have to deflate it, right? So this is actually a reality that we have to face, and I'd like to finish with that. Thank you very much for being with me and being so patient and bearing with me as I went through this global roundup in geopolitics and macroeconomics. Thank you. This was Takushi, your independent macroeconomist and geopolitical strategist.